Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm Michael Hagan from the class of 2015, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge from the class of 2005. Our guests today are Grace Maffucci from the senior class of 2022, and Michael Kregler from the Faculty of Music, PC's resident accompanist and who instructs jazz piano and composition. Grace is a music performance and Spanish major who recently completed her senior thesis, Cantos del Alma Alada, for which she translated and, with Michael, set to music a number of Latin American poems. We hope you're as excited as we are to hear about the project and to hear some of the poems performed. Grace, Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.
So, Grace, you're a student of music and of the Spanish language. Can you tell us a little bit about your path to studying these two disciplines?
Sure. So music came first for me. I've been a singer most of my life and was in private lessons and choir throughout high school, and so I knew I wanted to continue with music in college. But when I entered high school, I started taking Spanish, and I just fell in love. And so after 4 years of mostly honors Spanish classes, I knew that I had to continue in Spanish, and luckily at Providence College, I get to do both.
Michael, tell us a little bit about your background before coming to Providence College.
Well, like Grace, there was a lot of music involved. In high school, I did a lot of work with the choirs as well as with the jazz band. I did some Spanish study too, of course, in high school. But then in college, I knew I wanted to do music, so I went to the University of Miami, where there was also a lot of Spanish going on because it's Miami. I also studied jazz, composition, and ended up doing a lot of accompanying, both of choirs, singers, and instrumentalists. So it became evident that was going to be part of my career choices too. So after leaving Miami and moving here to Rhode Island, where I was working at Rhode Island College and now at Providence College, I also ended up meeting a lot of Colombian friends, which put my Spanish skills into better shape than they actually were in Miami. And long story short, I do music here in Rhode Island at Providence College.
So, Grace, in broad strokes, because we'll discuss your work more specifically in a minute, can you tell us about Cantos del Alma Alada, your collaborative project with Michael of adapting Latin American poetry in song?
Sure. So as I was preparing for my senior recital in my junior year, at the end of my junior year, I was putting together a repertoire, and I knew that as a Spanish major, I wanted to have Spanish language songs featured on my recital. But with my Latin American studies minor and my shared interest with Mike in Latin American culture, I really wanted to find some Latin American songs. And kind of looking through with my voice teacher, I just really couldn't find any songs that were really written for my voice. So there's really kind of a lack of Latin American poetry and art song. And so I was speaking to Mike about this, and we had the idea of Mike, being the composer in residence here, had the idea of writing songs if we just pick the poems together, and then that's kind of how it came about.
So I want to get us started with one of the poems right away, and we're very excited to share these with listeners. So what is the first song you'll be performing, and what is it about?
Sure. So the first song is called Entre los Árboles, which is the title of the poem by Luz Mary Giraldo. And it's really a song sort of about the rhythms of life, the passage of time, and nature. A lot of the songs in our set focus on nature, specifically birds. Mike and I are big bird fans. So there's a mention of the woodpecker kind of starting the day, a normal day in nature.
Michael, musically speaking, is there anything in the arrangement that listeners should listen out to for specifically?
Yeah, for sure. You'll hear many examples of the rumba clave. So this is an Afro-Cuban rhythm, which you'll hear Grace and I actually clap it at the beginning of the song, but it's also incorporated into the piano part as well as other parts. This is a super important rhythm that is the roots of all sorts of Latin American styles, including salsa. And it felt natural as one of the rhythms of life to go along with the context of the poem.
This is Entre los Árboles, set to music by Michael Kregler and performed by Grace Maffucci.
Oigo la vida
fuerte a la corteza, golpea contra el viento. Y con los días de madera, oigo la vida. Pájaro milenario golpea en el árbol de la vida. Y mientras las hojas caen, cambia el color del tiempo. Se agota como reloj de arena, marca muy lento, más lento cada vez, más lento, lento. Oigo sonar de nuevo la corteza. Otro pájaro inicia la jornada y el día comienza. Como la noche, como la noche, como la noche entre los árboles, entre los árboles.
Grace, you mentioned the poet behind the words you just sang. Could you tell us a little bit about her?
Yeah, so Luz Marie Giraldo is a Colombian female poet, still living, sort of contemporary. And we actually featured her twice in Cantos del Alma Alada because she just has such a rich array of poetry. I actually found out recently, doing a little bit of digging, that she studied music. She has some experience in piano and voice, which we didn't know before picking her poems, but it kind of speaks to the musicality of her work. And she has a lot of poems kind of about, again, birds, nature, sort of like those natural themes that really we were drawn to in choosing the works.
Michael, could you describe your approach to setting poetry to music? What, in your eyes, is the relationship between the composer's music and the poet's verse?
It's a great question, and this is a super important thing for me to consider philosophically as a composer. So first and foremost, I think about being faithful and having respect for the poem, which in almost all cases when it comes to art song or choral settings of poetry, the poems came first. So we're getting to use this pre-existing thing, sometimes by a very, very famous poet and sometimes a very famous poem, in our music. So we just have to be super respectful and, again, faithful to the poem. The phrase setting a poem itself bears a lot of meaning because we are setting the words to our own rhythms and melodies, but most importantly the rhythms, because there are speech-like rhythms that a poet would use when they recite their poem, and then the rhythms that are going to be assigned to the words that the singer has to deal with. And it's obviously easier to do if these are rhythms that suit the language as it's pronounced. And to that end, setting in Spanish was something that I hadn't even done for a long time, even after the point I was probably bilingual, because I wanted to trust myself to have spoken Spanish well enough at that point in time, so it sounded convincing. And I conferred with friends all the time. Does this sound reasonable to you? Does this sound authentic in the way that the words are sung. And just to make it, give an actual example of it, one very important thing when it comes to studying Spanish, which you often see done incorrectly, is either the inclusion of or a lack of elisions. In English, we have lots and lots of vowels that we use at the beginning of words. For example, elision. But in Spanish, that happens far less frequently, which is one reason the language sounds like it's going by really quickly. One of the lines that Grace sang moments ago, "Cambia el color del tiempo," would never be spoken that way. It would be spoken, "Cambia el color del tiempo." So as a composer, I'm literally using less syllables and probably less notes when I put that setting together. So the more of those that you do properly with the elisions, the more authentic the Spanish is going to sound to a native speaker when it's sung.
That reminds me of my senior year as an undergrad. I took a prosody seminar through the English department with Dr. Bennett. And there was one day, one of the verse forms that we wrote in were ballads. And there was one day, it was really cool, he had a few students who were musicians bring instruments in, and we actually set our ballads to music.
That's
which,
fantastic. Yeah.
This is a fair bit more sophisticated than that was, but it really gave me an appreciation for the close relationship between the rhythms of speech and the rhythms of music, and how poetry and song go hand in hand. So taking a step back, I want to talk a little bit about music studies more broadly at Providence College. What distinguishes, Grace, the music performance studies experience at PC?
I think the biggest thing that I've really noticed about my music education here is the individualized attention I get, because it's not a huge conservatory program. So with fewer students, we have just really devoted faculty and staff who are just really care about my interests and what I want to do and my success. But at the same time, because PC has such a diverse array of classes and we have requirements and different courses, I'm able to have a very well-rounded education while I have a very full music experience here. So I feel like, I thought some people would think it's a pain, but I actually found it to be an honor to be able to be in civ classes, philosophy, theology, and at the same time, being like a full-time musician and full-time music student here at Providence College.
Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, basically what she said. Our music department at PC is strong, but it's humble. And so it's natural for us to want to feed off of our students' interest and to help cultivate them whenever it's possible, and especially when there are things that are in our own wheelhouse. So in Grace's case, her passion for jazz, Spanish, Latin America, the bossa nova at one point, she did an independent study in that with me. It ended up naturally inspiring a lot of what she ended up studying and performing here at PC.
So returning to your project, how and when did your collaboration begin?
It started with the conversation. I went into Mike's office and I said, I just don't know what to put in my recital. There's just not enough Latin American art song. And he said, well, let's do it ourselves. And so over the last summer, the summer before my senior year, we were sort of sending each other poems back and forth. And we came up with like a list of about 30 poems from Latin American authors all over Latin America. And then we narrowed it down to eventually the 5 that are featured in our set. And then, by October of my senior year, Mike had given me the music and we were rehearsing it. And my recital wasn't until April of 2022, but we had been rehearsing and basically we had been ready to perform the songs at the beginning of my second semester.
Yeah, I think that your project is definitely a testament to the fact that the best senior projects and theses begin with having no idea what you're going to do for your senior project or theses. Best place to start. Michael, what was your reaction to Grace approaching you about these poems?
I was thrilled because I hadn't said anything in Spanish for a while. I always loved doing it, but I was especially eager to focus on the Latin American aspect of it. I already mentioned Colombia. For Grace, it's Mexico and possibly Puerto Rico, but I think Mexico. As far as like her main interest when it comes to the Spanish language and culturally, and for me, it's Colombians. So anyways, I was really ready to focus on Latin American poetry and with someone who knew so much already about the Spanish language and Latin America.
So let's hear another song. Grace, what will you be performing next?
Sure. So our next piece is by the same poet, Luz Mary Giraldo, and this one is called La Hora de los Pájaros.
Michael, any notes about the arrangement or about the composition?
Sure. In this one, the poetry, if I've done my job correctly, is informing the mood of the music. Some adjectives that come to mind when I think of this poem are restless and surreal. There's a lot of activity going on. And so it felt natural to borrow some impressionistic Debussy, Ravel type piano gestures. This is French music where they were very interested in imagery and trying to make that imagery come out through the way the piano is used. For example, one of the translations, or some of the translations of the lines, words being manipulated by a seamstress, the weaving of tunics, the wind being exhausted by the birds. These are all these surreal, active kind of images in the poem, and so hopefully you'll hear that come out through the musical content as well.
All right, this is La Hora de los Pájaros, composed by Michael Kregler and performed by Grace Maffucci.
La herida de la noche inasible costurera, la palabra cubre, la palabra cubre, la palabra cubre, la palabra cubre, con tela gañosa la herida de la noche. Juega la libertad, o sueña la aventura, como eterna Penélope, teje la tónica de todos. De Silvana, el secreto de la espera, hasta inventar un nuevo rostro o el espejo sin nombre. Inasible costurera, voy a pasar el viento, pasar el viento, pasar el viento, pasar el viento, fatigado por los pájaros.
So, Grace, you translated all of the poems that you two set to music into English as well. What was that process like?
That was another kind of collaborative work. Mike and I really worked on it together and over a period of a couple of weeks. So I knew that translating the poems was not going to be as easy as a word for word translation because that's just not the way that the languages just aren't congruent like that. So I did start out with kind of a word-for-word translation, and as Mike said, some of the texts were a little bit complex, so the word-for-word translation was very confusing and a little difficult. But we started out with that, and then we kind of sent the translations back and forth, and I really relied on Mike's experience with studying poetry and reading poetry in both English and Spanish to kind of help, to kind of fill the holes in the languages where the Spanish just didn't quite translate into English well, and how we could kind of keep the meaning and the essence of the poem in Spanish, but translate that into English so that the English-speaking audience would be able to understand what we understood from the Spanish, and also kind of in the translations, kind of fitting the meaning from the Spanish into like the rhythm of the English language. So it was not easy, especially with certain poems more than others, but Mike and I really worked hard to make sure that we felt that we had a final product of English translations that were loyal to the originals.
And where the rubber hits the road, what was like one of the hardest lines or series of lines for you two to translate?
There were definitely lines along the way, but I specifically think of the song you just heard, La Hora de los Pájaros. That was because of the surreal and metaphoric nature of the poems. We went for a literal translation first and then into the poetic. And here's a line to show how the process was, how we kind of got there. So the original Spanish first line of that poem is Inasible y costurera la palabra cubre con tela engañosa la herida de la noche. Which, this is sort of close, but if you put this into the Google Translate, you will get elusive and seamstress. The word covers with deceitful cloth the wound of the night. And although some of those were good, I started to realize that seamstress was being used as a noun here, even though it appeared to be an adjective, and that it was really the words that were functioning as the seamstress as far as I understood the poem. So what ended up in Grace's translations on her recital program was, an elusive seamstress, words cover with furtive fabric the wounds of the night. And so on and so forth, but the idea is to get that meaning to come across in English as if the poem were written in English. So.
Yeah, and I must say from reading the poems in English, I mean, you really accomplish that. They read beautifully in English, even though it's not their original language. So well done. So Michael, when you're setting poetry to music, do you feel like your music adds something new to the poems, or does it more just accentuate what is already there?
I would definitely pick the second of those two thoughts. But again, I just want to emphasize that faithfulness to the poem. You know, I want the poems to inspire the sound as much as possible, and I want to do my best to make it easy on the singer to help express the sentiment. So, for lack of a better way of saying it, I don't want the music to sound so weird that the singer has to work twice as hard to sing this poem that wasn't even meant to be sung in the first place. You know, I want to make it, I want to capture the mood and the pacing. I want to capture a mood and a pacing that would feel right to a native speaker. And if that happens, then for me, the setting is successful.
So, Grace, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about your exciting recent news. I hear that you've got big plans for after graduation, don't you?
Yes, I do. I will be an English teaching assistant in Mexico for the next academic year as part of the U.S. Student Fulbright program. And, as Mike alluded to before, although no Mexican poets made it into our our set,
not intentional.
My heart is sort of most drawn to Mexico and that aspect of Latin American culture. So I am extremely excited to be going there next year.
That is very exciting. What will you miss most about Providence College?
Oof. I'd have to say it's the people. I know everyone says that, but specifically the people I get to see every day in the music department, especially Mike. We've just done so much work together, and over the past few years, I've just so looked forward to going into the Smith building and seeing my professors and friends in the music department, and being able to have all these experiences. I mean, I don't think there's going to be another time in my life where I get to, put on a couple recitals that I just choose to do, and I get support from, the department to do so. And I doubt that I'll have another opportunity to, to work with a composer and musician as incredible as Mike.
Now, Mike and other music faculty aren't the only faculty members that you've collaborated with. On the foreign language side of your academics, you've had some pretty interesting faculty collaborations as well. Want to say anything about those?
Absolutely. So in my junior year, I was awarded an undergraduate research grant and to study Afro-Cuban culture pre and post the Cuban Revolution through the visual, performing, and literary arts with Dr. Monica Simal of the Foreign Language Studies Department. And she is of Cuban descent, and being able to work with her to study all of that, and speaking in Spanish the whole time with her, but also presenting work in both languages was really great for me in terms of, my linguistic experience, but also I was able to incorporate a lot of my music studies, and it became almost like an ethnomusicology project. And I got to present that sort of my completed research at the Big East Research Symposium at Madison Square Garden this past March, and I will be presenting it again at the the celebration of student creativity through the Center for Engaged Learning. So I've had a lot of really wonderful opportunities with that.
So, Michael, what's one of your biggest takeaways from working with Grace on this project?
So I want to set this up with a short anecdote. Although I can't remember the specific joke, I remember one time laughing at a joke. It might have been one that I told Grace or another a Colombian friend. But then someone asked, "Oh, what's the joke in English?" And as I started to translate it, the thought occurred to me, and this happens more often than you'd think, like, oh, this is hard to translate. I guess I really am bilingual, because sometimes for someone who, when you reach a certain point, you don't trust that you actually are bilingual. Well, I'm just translating really quickly in my head. And then when you're posed with the challenge of actually translating it, oh, okay, I guess I am thinking purely in Spanish. So the takeaway there is that it's really important how well one speaks a language if they're going to write music using it or perform it, as Grace did with this set. So, and I've had choirs perform pieces that I wrote in Spanish, and it was great as an experience. But long before we got to any sort of interpretation, we were just dealing with the pronunciation, and that alone takes so much of your time that you just arrive at a different place, and it just ends up being a different kind of experience. So, like I already said, Grace being bilingual made it a very different experience. In fact, Grace and I have probably spoken in Spanish about 85% and 90% of the time when she came to PC, and of course when she showed up and said, "Oh, I speak Spanish," I was like, okay, we'll see how much that you speak. And then it became clear to me that we could, I still think of like people like walking down the hallway and other faculty, just, are they speaking in Spanish? And it just has become normal. And then of course, if they join the conversation, we switch to English, but it's honestly all the time that we would speak that way. So with Cantos del Alma Alada, it ended up being very rewarding and gratifying, since I knew we'd be able to dive into the musical ideas and the character of the songs, the emotion of the text, that we'd be able to do that right away. So I'm just incredibly thankful that I got to do this project with Grace, although if I hadn't done it with Grace, then it just wouldn't have been the same project.
And Grace, before I ask you the same question about takeaways, I'm realizing I don't think that we ever gave a translation for Cantos del Alma Alada. What does the title of your project translate to?
Yeah, so Cantos del Alma Alada, the title by Mike, basically translates to Songs of the Winged Soul, and that kind of alluding to our love for birds and that the nature of the songs that are very focused on birds, but also what birds represent.
And another just interesting thing in this conversation that I'm realizing, I went into this conversation thinking that I had a pretty good understanding of how the roles were divided up in this, but the integration of your efforts is really something. I mean, I'll ask Grace, what about this? And you'll say, well, when Mike did this, and Mike will ask the same question, you'll say, when Grace did this. It seems like you two, you were heavily involved in every part of the project together, and that's really remarkable. So Grace, same question for you. What are your biggest takeaways from working with Michael?
I think, I got a very unique experience to kind of get in the mind of a composer, because, we chose the poems together, but Mike had a good eye for which poems were going to be easier to set to music, or that would carry through in a musical setting. So I kind of learned about those distinctions, and then kind of rehearsing for the first time the pieces with Mike, and he would show me like how he had written something so that a certain word could come out, or like how I should perform it to bring out a certain word that maybe I wouldn't do if I were just reading the poem. So I really got to kind of see how poetry in music, it's not just a matter of picking a poem and putting music to it. It's a real, combined effort of having like that musical background and also, appreciating and understanding the poetry. So I felt like that was a huge one. And also, what Mike spoke to about that idea of being bilingual, when we were translating the poems, I was like, this is so much harder than I thought it would be. And, I realized kind of how, for one thing, how grateful I am to be bilingual, and Mike has really helped me to get there. But, just like the importance or the kind of beauty of languages that, they aren't just able to directly translate from one to the other. Each language carries its own character, and I think we've really been able to explore that with this project.
And I could just add to that, and she mentioned the beauty of languages, Grace did. That's a huge part of why this happened in the first place, but why this podcast is happening, because we push to have the lecture in Moore Hall, which seemed to spark the interest in this, that was, in our minds, an opportunity to do something interdisciplinary where, although it was people appreciated this set of songs when we did it at Grace's recital, we wanted to do it in a situation where some of the language faculty could attend and offer their thoughts, and to see that people in the music department were doing something so seriously involved with language and the Spanish language in particular. So
we have time for one more song. Grace, what will you be performing last?
Sure. So we will be performing Toma mi mano, which translates to Take My Hand, by the Cuban female poet Fina Garcia Marus.
And Michael, anything that listeners should pay particular attention to in this composition?
Yes. In the piano, you'll hear Bill Evans style voicing. So these are thick, lush harmonic choices that you hear flavor the thing and that you hear in the background. And there's also jazz-like phrasing in the vocal line, which I knew Grace would be good at because of her background in jazz. And I knew this conceiving the song's character from the beginning. You can hear this in the almost improvisatory quality of the lines, in the free and speech-like rhythms, as well as the amount of space that happens between each of the vocal entrances. So this sparseness that's created also ends up contributing to the song's mood.
All right, this is Toma mi mano, performed by Grace Maffucci and composed by Michael Kregler.
Toma mi mano, toma mi mano, hazme sentir que estás cerca en la novedad. Que mi mano es nueva en tu mano y es mi mano porque tú la tomas, porque tú la tomas. Y mi pecho silencioso como ella, anhelante. En el banco arrobado, suspendido por todas las estrellas. En que mi mano es nueva en tu mano y es mi mano porque tú la tomas, porque tú la tomas.
Subscribe to the Providence College Podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, as well as your smart speaker. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.